My soul cries out, my soul cries out for you. These bones cry out.
Today we're going to take a look at the Parable of the Sower. And as we take a look at this parable, we're going to see that there is just a lot here. And I'm going to do my best to see if I can navigate through it in a timely and concise manner, as we try to do in all of these podcasts. But I would tell you that the Parable of the Sower is perhaps the most important, certainly one of the most important parables in the Bible for a number of reasons. First is that it marks a shift in Jesus' ministry where he actually begins teaching in parables and illustrating the kingdom of heaven with metaphors and pictures, if you will, in order to allow people to gain insight into what it is going to be like. The second thing I think that's interesting about this particular parable is that there is an account of it found in all three of the synoptic gospels. And so as we study we're going to be looking at Matthew, Mark, and Luke to see if we can harmonize and synergize all three accounts of this parable in order to come up with a more accurate and hopefully deeper understanding of it. It is also the only parable where, since it is the first one, presumably, where Jesus actually gives us an explanation of why he speaks in parables instead of just plainly, as the disciples ask. And Jesus' explanation of why it is that he speaks in parables is just as shocking and mind-blowing today as it was in the first century. Another unique aspect of the Parable of the Sower is it is one of the only parables where Jesus not only tells us the parable, but also gives his own commentary and explanation on the parable so we can truly have a much deeper insight into what he was conveying. And lastly, as we look at the account as described in the Gospel of Mark, there's an interesting line in there. And Jesus asks a question of the disciples that is not recorded in either of the other two Gospels. When asked why he speaks in parables, it says, "And he said to them, 'Do you not understand this parable? How will you understand all of the parables?'" And so from that, many have understood this to mean that the parable of the sower is the key to understanding the rest of the parables. And this has kind of sat in my mind for quite some time as I began to think about this and say to myself, why would this be the key? And I think I have a plausible explanation for this, and I'll run it by you. And if you think it works, then great. So let's start off in Matthew 13 and just read it and see where it will take us. Matthew 13. That day Jesus went out of the house and was sitting by the sea, and large crowds gathered to him. So he got in a boat, sat down, and the whole crowd was standing on the beach. And he spoke many things to them in parables, saying, "Behold, the sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some of the seeds fell beside the road, and the birds came and ate them up. Others fell on the rocky places where they did not have much depth of soil, and immediately they sprang up, but because they had no depth of soil. And when the sun had risen, they were scorched, and because they had no root, they withered away. Others fell among the thorns, and the thorns came up and choked them out, and others fell on the good soil, and yielded a crop, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. He who has ears to hear, let him hear." And the disciples, it says, came and said to him, "Why do you speak to them in parables?" So that's very interesting. So Jesus is out in the boat, and he sits down in the boat, and he speaks this parable, amongst apparently other parables that he taught that day, to presumably, couple hundred people maybe that were standing along the seashore. And it looks like after he got in from the boat and he was by himself, the disciples immediately came to him and said, "Why do you speak to them in parables?" Because the disciples were observing Jesus's preaching, and they were observing the crowd, and they understood something that they didn't think Jesus understood, and that was that he was teaching these things, but nobody was really getting it. So anyone knows that the objective of any effective communicator is to make sure his audience is following along and understanding what he's telling them in order to get the desired response. I mean, a politician gives a speech in order to get votes. A salesman gives a presentation in order to make a sale. And a preacher preaches to people in order to get them to turn to God and be saved. That's what everybody just understands. So the answer that Jesus gave them that day was the very last thing they would have ever expected. Here's what he says. To you, the disciples, it has been granted to know the mysteries of the kingdom, but to them it has not been granted. And then he goes on to quote Isaiah about this people. He says, you will keep on hearing but not understand. You will keep on seeing but not perceive. For the heart of this people has become dull, and with their ears they scarcely hear, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise they would see with their eyes and hear with their ears. And then something very interesting. And they would understand with their heart and return, and I would heal them. And we know the Bible is very clear that God says to everyone who comes to me, I will no wise cast out. And so in order to prevent these people from being saved, he has to prevent them from coming to them. Therefore, he speaks to them in parables so that they will not hear and see and understand and return. And it's just this earth-shattering revelation to disciples. And then he goes on and says, but blessed are your eyes because they see, and your ears because they hear. So what is it that Jesus intends for his disciples to see, and what is it that he intends to hide from everyone else? And if we take an overview of this parable and we just kind of look at it, there's no disagreement on what the first soil is. The first soil is the person that rejects the gospel outright and just turns and leaves, and there's absolutely no effect whatsoever. This is the unsaved person. And there's no disagreement about the foresoil. This is the person that embraces the gospel and produces fruit, some 30, some 60, some 100-fold. This is the desired result of the gospel in a genuine believer. But there's a lot of discussion on what the second and third soil are. Okay, so let's take a look at the second soil, and as we read through these passages, let us place ourselves among the disciples hearing this for the first time, and let's pretend that we've never heard of Charles Stanley or John Piper, and let us let the words just flow and say what they would say, and let us hear what we would have heard in that first century in this context. So here we go. Starting in Matthew, let's take a look at the second soil, and he says, the one on whom the seed was sown on the rocky places, this is the man who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet he has no firm root in himself, but is only temporary. And when affliction or persecution arises because of the word, immediately he falls away. And if we turn to Luke's account of the same soil, we see that Luke describes it as he having no firm root, and they believe for a while, and in time of temptation fall away. So if we look at the passage itself, we see that they believe for a while. And if we think back to the first soil, it says that the evil one came and took what was sown in their heart so that they could not believe and be saved. So clearly, believing leads to salvation, and in every context in the Bible, what must I do to be saved? Believe. These second soil believed. Now, we can redefine this as it wasn't an adequate belief, but there's no such description of that in any of these passages. It doesn't say it was a false belief or it was a lack of genuine belief. As a matter of fact, the wording actually seems to indicate the very opposite. It says that they were temporary. Now, temporary does not mean it wasn't genuine. If I said, I am going to give you some temporary housing, that doesn't mean that it isn't genuine housing. It just doesn't mean that it's permanent. It doesn't last. But it is genuine for the time that it was in place. I mean, that's just how we read the language. And it says he falls away. And how does he fall away, or what makes him fall away? Well, I would submit to you that the second soil is not someone who just heard some light sermon, responded to it because he was told that Jesus loves him and has a wonderful plan for his life, but he understood the gospel enough to suffer persecution for it. I mean, these second soil isn't just a month or 2 months or even maybe a year. How many of us in the church today have ever gotten to the place where we suffer persecution that arises because of the word? And so this wasn't just some lighthearted, loosey-goosey gospel. This was the real gospel, and they just weren't up to suffering persecution. When we move on to the third soil, again we see an escalating nature of all of these soils. So the first one, they did not believe at all. The second one believes for a while, it's only temporary. And the third one I would submit to you is somebody who has believed for many years. That's what the passage seems to indicate. Here's what Matthew says. And the one on whom the seed was sown among the thorns, this is the man who hears the word, and the worry of the world and the deceitfulness of wealth choke the word, and it becomes unfruitful. And in the same way in the Matthew passage, it says, this seed is the one that fell among the thorns, and these are the ones who have heard, and as they go on their way are choked with the worries and the riches and the pleasures of this life, and bring no fruit to maturity. And so the phraseology which says it becomes unfruitful clearly indicates that there was fruit produced for a time. And I would submit to you that if the analogy holds that the roots are not shallow, but have gone deep enough to produce a tree with leaves, and we know that it isn't for several years that we can expect fruit production from a tree, and this tree produced fruit for some time. And in every example of fruit production in the scriptures, it always speaks of that which proceeds from a pure heart, from a redeemed heart, from abiding in the vine. You will know them by their fruit. And so unless we want to just completely just alter and change the meaning of what fruitfulness is in every single other example in the New Testament, we have to see that this person seems to be somebody who was in the church for years and maybe even got to a point of being a Bible teacher or an elder, maybe even a pastor. But over time, the roots are choked out by things that grow around it, and that takes time as well. And often it's an imperceptible choking out. The fruit just doesn't disappear one day. It becomes less robust, and it becomes less plentiful on a tree, and it may take years from the start of the thorns choking it out to the point where it becomes barren. And then we have the fourth soil. And the one on whom the seed was sown on the good soil, this is the man who hears the word and understands it and who bears fruit and brings forth, some 100-fold, some 60, and some 30. And again, going to the Luke passage, it says, who have heard the word in an honest and good heart, and hold it fast, and bear fruit with perseverance. So clearly this is the person in whom the Lord is well pleased, who does what is expected. And so let me ask you this question. What is the purpose of this parable? Is it to show us that there are going to be some false believers in the church who look like they're believers for a while, but they really aren't? I mean, that's the objective of the parable following the one in Matthew where it talks about the wheat and the tares. So is this just a repeat of that? Okay, so if Jesus' description of the middle two soils represents people who never genuinely believed, they were self-deceived, but at the same time, one group of people stayed around long enough where they learned enough about the word that their testimony resulted in affliction and persecution, and another group stayed around long enough where they were bearing fruit, perhaps for even years, and then fell away. That's very curious, isn't it? And I would submit to you, those who hold that they were never genuine believers, again, are forced into this determination, not because of the plain language of the text itself, but because it has been determined that justification is a one-time, irrevocable event, and that it is apart from anything that we do, any works that we do that might contribute to our salvation, and that once we have come to this genuine faith, that God will sustain this faith, and God is responsible to bring us all the way to salvation. And they say that's where the assurance is. But if we look at this parable, that should give us anything but real assurance. As a matter of fact, it really should terrify us and never provide us with assurance. Here's what I mean. These middle two soils, they didn't say, well, I'm a false believer. I never genuinely believed, and I'm just going to stick around here for a while until it gets a little tough. No, they thought they were believers and Christians, and those around them didn't look at them and say, maybe you're a false believer. Maybe you're going to fall away at some point in time. And if these people were never believers, but thought they were, and at a time fell away, how do you not know that you're not one of them? And after bearing fruit for perhaps many years, maybe holding a high position in the church, might not fall away? Because after all, if it doesn't depend on anything you do and you're just relying on Christ to complete what he started, but these people thought he started something as much as you did, but obviously he didn't complete it in them according to your theology, then how do you know that he's going to complete it in you? And when you take out all the responsibility, all the requirement to respond in a way that has expectations, that's what you're left with. But if we look at the fourth seed, it says that these are the ones who have heard the word in an honest and a good heart, and hold it fast, and bear fruit with perseverance. I used to use this illustration all the time when I was teaching this, and I would hand somebody in the class a Bible, and I would say, please hold on to this. And they would hold it, and I would just grab it out of their hands. And then I would give it back to them, and I said, okay, this time, hold it fast. And I'd try to grab it, and I couldn't take it away from them because they were following the instruction to hold it fast. See, that's what they do. and they bear fruit with perseverance. Well, whose perseverance? Jesus' perseverance? No, our perseverance that we apply to this. And then the other group says, well, once I call upon the name of the Lord, I'm automatically saved. So what this is talking about, the middle two soils, is that they had their works burned up, but they were still saved. And what point of a parable is that? Just for some information that's a curiosity and maybe interesting, but has no real bearing on how we would respond or how we would live our lives? Or could it be that this parable, as Mark has set it up, when it says, do you not understand this parable? How will you understand all the parables? That the pattern that Jesus is setting up is really a warning to true believers to respond in the way that is expected and that would enable them to inherit the promises. That this parable here is the pattern for all of the other parables, whether we're talking about the man who is building the tower, or we're talking about the prodigal son, or we're talking about the 10 virgins, or we're talking about the parable of the talents. And you can go down the list that this is the pattern that says, once you have been bestowed with this incredible gift of grace, run with diligence and perseverance, and know that many run but don't run all the way. Or many run, but many get distracted. Don't be one of those. Run all the way to the end. And this gracious warning and instruction is the pattern for the believer's faith walk. Here is the perseverance of the saints who keep the commandments of God and their faith in Jesus. So here is the question that would flow naturally from this incredible parable. Have you been granted to know the mysteries of the kingdom, or have you not been granted to know those mysteries? Because the people who were standing on the seashore that day heard this parable and they came away with an interpretation of it. But their interpretation was incorrect, whatever it was, because they had not been granted to know the mysteries of the kingdom. And if you're interpreting this parable as just an interesting story about people who never were saved and fall away, and wow, isn't that a shame for them? Or that this is just a parable to show that preachers, that you'll preach to many people and very few will actually respond, so don't get disheartened by it. Or your interpretation is that, well, everybody is saved anyway, but some just won't bear fruit, and so they have all their works burned up. Then I would submit to you that you have not been granted to know the mystery of the kingdom. But if you look at this parable for what it says in the natural language, and you allow the word temporary to be temporary and unfruitful to be unfruitful, and that you respond in a way that results in perseverance and holding fast, and that you see the logic of this parable as a pattern for all the other parables, and you don't have to not only twist this parable, but you don't have to twist any of the others as well. And as you see this as a warning and instruction of a race to be run, then I would submit to you that there is a very good chance that you have been granted to know the mysteries of this kingdom. And glory to God, run this race with all of your soul, all of your heart, all of your strength. Pay attention to the warnings and be like the one who produces fruit 30, 60, and 100-fold. To he who has ears to hear, let him hear.